£10,000 a year. That's what Edward, Duke of Windsor, claimed he was barely surviving on in the early 1950s. According to the Bank of England's inflation calculator, £10,000 in 1952 has the purchasing power of £249,750 today. In American dollars, $338,000 annually. That's what barely surviving looked like for the former King of England, and he said this to his mother, his grieving 84-year-old mother, days after she'd buried her second son. But here's the thing. This isn't really a story about Edward, not entirely. Because to understand why those words are so obscene, you need to understand the man who paid that allowance, the man who carried a crown he never wanted, the man who worked himself into an early grave at 56 while his elder brother complained about money from Paris. This is the story of King George VI and what his brother's selfishness actually cost. Before we go further, I need to correct something that drives me mad. If you've seen the viral clip of this crown scene, millions have. You've probably seen it captioned wrong. Comments everywhere calling the elderly woman the Queen Mother. She isn't. This is Queen Mary, different person entirely. Queen Mary was born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck on May 26, 1867. She became Queen Consort when her husband took the throne as King George V in 1910. When George V died on January 20, 1936, Mary became a dowager queen. But she never used the title Queen Mother. She was styled simply as Her Majesty Queen Mary. The Queen Mother, the one you're thinking of, was Elizabeth, wife of King George VI and mother of Queen Elizabeth II. Different generation, different woman, different tragedy. Queen Mary watched her eldest son abandon the throne in 1936, watched her second son reluctantly assume it, watched that second son age decades in 15 years, then watched him die. She was 84 when she buried him. Just over a year later, on March 24, 1953, she'd be dead herself, 10 weeks before she could even see her granddaughter Elizabeth crowned. And in those final months, her surviving eldest son wanted to discuss his allowance. But let's go back to December 1936, back to the moment everything broke. Prince Albert, Duke of York, the man who would become King George VI, was born on December 14, 1895. Second son, the spare, not the heir. He had a stammer so severe that public speaking caused him physical anguish. He'd served in the Royal Navy, fought at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923, and settled into the comfortable obscurity of a royal's second son. He wasn't supposed to be king. He didn't want to be king. The very thought terrified him. Then his brother fell in love. Edward VIII's relationship with Wallis Simpson, American, twice divorced, utterly unacceptable as a prospective queen, created a constitutional crisis that Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin managed with brutal efficiency. Baldwin told Edward plainly, "Marry her, and you cannot remain king." The Church of England wouldn't accept it. The cabinet wouldn't approve it. The dominions wouldn't have it. Edward chose Wallis. The instrument of abdication was signed on December 10, 1936. Edward made his famous radio broadcast on December 11th, declaring he couldn't carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the woman I love. And Albert, shy, stammering, reluctant Albert, became King George VI. His reaction to the news has been documented by multiple biographers. When his mother, Queen Mary, told him what was happening, George reportedly broke down and sobbed like a child. This wasn't ambition thwarted or opportunity seized. This was a man watching a weight he'd never trained to carry descend onto his shoulders. His coronation took place on May 12, 1937. It was the first coronation ever broadcast by radio, which meant millions of people around the world could hear every hesitation, every struggle with the formal responses. George white-knuckled his way through it. He stumbled on certain words, but he finished. He took the crown his brother had thrown away, and he wore it. Meanwhile, Edward married Wallis Simpson on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Condé in France. He would spend the rest of his life insisting he'd been treated unfairly. George's first major test came in 1939. Not the war, that would come later. First came North America. The royal tour of Canada and the United States in May and June 1939 was a diplomatic mission disguised as a goodwill visit. War with Germany was clearly coming. Britain needed American support, or at least American sympathy. And Franklin Roosevelt wanted to meet the new king. George and Queen Elizabeth departed on May 6, 1939, aboard the Empress of Australia. They arrived in Quebec City on May 17th, after a crossing delayed by fog and icebergs. What followed was the first visit by a reigning British monarch to Canada, and then, on June 7th, they crossed into the United States. The American visit climaxed at Hyde Park, Roosevelt's family estate in New York, on June 11, 1939. And this is where the famous hot dog incident occurred. Roosevelt served hot dogs at a picnic, American hot dogs, to the King of England. The press treated it as either a charming informality or a diplomatic insult, depending on the paper. But here's the detail that matters. George ate the hot dog. He reportedly asked for another. He sat on Roosevelt's porch, ate American food, and talked about the coming war. Queen Elizabeth later recalled that Roosevelt told George, "My mother thinks I should have given you a formal dinner with gold plate and all that, but I wanted you to see what an American hot dog looked like." George understood what Roosevelt was doing, building a relationship, making the British royals seem human, accessible, democratic. And George played along, because George understood that being royal meant serving purposes larger than personal dignity. That was the difference between George and Edward, right there. One ate the hot dog, the other would have complained about the presentation. 3 months later, on September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. George's war years have been well documented, but certain details bear repeating because they explain everything that came after. He and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London during the Blitz. When their daughters, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, were evacuated to Windsor Castle for safety, their parents stayed in London. They could have gone anywhere. They chose to stay. Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times during the war. 9 times. The most significant attack came on September 13, 1940, when a German bomber flew straight down the Mall and dropped 5 high-explosive bombs on the palace in broad daylight. George and Elizabeth were in residence. The bombs destroyed the palace chapel and blew out windows throughout the building. Queen Elizabeth's response became legendary. "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The East End of London was being destroyed nightly. Working-class neighborhoods reduced to rubble, while the wealthy evacuated to the countryside. If the royal family had fled, the symbolism would have been devastating. Instead, they stayed, they took the same bombs, and they toured the damage alongside their subjects. George established a routine with Winston Churchill that lasted throughout the war. Tuesday luncheons at Buckingham Palace. Every week, the king and his prime minister would eat together and discuss the war's progress in private. No secretaries, no notes. Just the 2 men, often disagreeing, always committed to the same cause. Their relationship began awkwardly. Churchill had supported Edward during the abdication crisis. had even urged Edward to fight for the throne rather than surrender it. George knew this. The tension was real. But as the war progressed, mutual respect developed into genuine friendship. Churchill would later say that their Tuesday lunches were among the most important meetings of his week. George visited the troops constantly. He traveled to North Africa in June 1943, flying into recently liberated Tunisia to meet with Allied commanders and review the troops. He went to Malta, to Italy, to Normandy within days of D-Day. He crossed the Rhine with Allied forces in March 1945. These weren't ceremonial visits. George put himself in genuine danger repeatedly. His flight to North Africa involved crossing airspace that German fighters still contested. When he visited troops in forward positions, he was within artillery range. While George was doing this, Edward was serving as governor of the Bahamas. The Bahamas posting deserves explanation. It wasn't a reward. It was exile. Churchill arranged it specifically to keep Edward away from Europe and away from the Nazi sympathies he'd demonstrated with his 1937 visit to Germany, when he'd met Hitler at Berchtesgaden and toured Nazi facilities while appearing to give fascist salutes in photographs. Documents captured after the war revealed that Nazi intelligence had considered Edward a potential asset. The Open University's historical research is blunt. Was Edward VIII a Nazi sympathizer? Damning evidence in the archives suggests he wanted England bombed to force an Anglo-German alliance. CBC documentary research notes that historians believe Edward actively collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War. So while George was taking bombs and touring rubble and lunching with Churchill to discuss strategy, Edward was in the Caribbean, far from the war, complaining about his accommodations and his allowance. The war ended on May 8, 1945. George delivered the victory speech from Buckingham Palace to enormous crowds. He appeared on the balcony with Churchill. The moment of triumph was real. But the war had broken something in him. George was a heavy smoker, a habit that might have been manageable in peacetime, but proved disastrous when combined with years of accumulated stress. By the late 1940s, his health was visibly declining. He looked older than his years. He tired easily. His color was bad. In 1949, doctors diagnosed serious arterial disease affecting his legs. The medical term was Berger's disease, or thromboangiitis obliterans. The circulation problems were severe enough to raise fears of gangrene and amputation. On March 12, 1949, George underwent a lumbar sympathectomy, a surgical procedure to improve blood flow to his legs. The operation was performed at Buckingham Palace itself, the surgeons setting up an operating theater in a converted room. George recovered enough to resume his duties, but he was never the same. The smoking continued, the stress continued, and in 1951, everything got worse. By mid-1951, George was experiencing persistent respiratory symptoms, a cough that wouldn't clear, breathlessness that couldn't be explained by normal fatigue. In September, doctors ordered a bronchoscopy. They found what they'd feared, a malignant tumor in his left lung. On September 23, 1951, Sir Clement Price Thomas, one of Britain's leading chest surgeons, performed a pneumonectomy at Buckingham Palace. They removed George's entire left lung. The surgery was successful in technical terms. The cancer didn't spread. But removing an entire lung from a man whose circulatory system was already compromised, whose body had been battered by years of stress and heavy smoking, was devastating. George survived the surgery. He never really recovered from it. Photographs from his final months show a gaunt, hollow-eyed man. The face that had appeared on coins and stamps throughout the empire now looked ancient, exhausted, finished. He was 55 years old and looked 70. On January 31, 1952, George traveled to London Airport to see off his daughter Elizabeth and her husband Philip, who were departing for an official tour of East Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. Newsreel footage of this moment is haunting. George stands on the tarmac, hatless, in the cold, watching his daughter's plane take off. He looks frail. He looks sick. He's waving goodbye to a daughter he would never see again. George returned to Sandringham, his beloved Norfolk estate. On February 5, 1952, he spent the day doing what he loved, shooting on the estate, walking the grounds, enjoying the countryside. He retired to bed that evening in good spirits. His valet, James MacDonald, brought him his cocoa at 11:30 p.m. Everything seemed normal. George died in his sleep during the night. Coronary thrombosis, his overtaxed heart, finally stopped. MacDonald discovered him at 7:30 a.m. on February 6, 1952. He was 56 years old. Princess Elizabeth was at the Treetops Hotel in Nairobi, Kenya, when she learned she was queen. She was 25. She flew home immediately, landing at Heathrow on February 7th, where Prime Minister Churchill and other officials met her on the tarmac. And where was Edward? New York. He boarded the RMS Queen Mary, yes, the ship named after their mother, departing on February 7th. The Atlantic crossing took 5 days. He arrived in Southampton around February 12th or 13th, just in time for the funeral. George VI's body lay in state at Westminster Hall from February 11th to 15th, 1952. Hundreds of thousands of British subjects queued in the February cold to file past his coffin and pay their respects. The state funeral took place on February 15th at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Queen Mary, 84 years old and devastated, attended. Archival photographs show her watching the funeral procession pass from a window at Marlborough House. And somewhere in this fog of grief, somewhere between the lying in state and the funeral, between the crowds of mourning subjects and the formal ceremonies of transition, Edward raised the subject of money. The specific dialogue in The Crown is dramatized. We don't have a transcript of the exact words Edward spoke to his mother in February 1952. What we have is documentation of a pattern. Philip Ziegler's authorized biography of Edward VIII, published in 1991, considered the standard scholarly work, documents Edward's persistent complaints about his financial arrangements. This wasn't a one-time lapse. This was his character. Edward's allowance had started at approximately £25,000 per year after the abdication. But his public complaints about money, his Nazi associations, his problematic wartime conduct, all of it had embarrassed the crown. Palace advisors pressured George to reduce the allowance. By the late 1940s, it had settled at £10,000. £10,000, paid from George's personal funds, not public money. The king's private resources handed over annually to the brother who'd abandoned his duty. George paid this allowance while working himself to death. He paid it while taking bombs in London. He paid it while losing a lung to cancer. He paid it until his heart stopped. And Edward thought it wasn't enough. Let me tell you what £10,000 bought the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Their primary Paris residence was at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the Bois de Boulogne, a mansion leased from the city of Paris. They maintained additional properties in the south of France near Antibes. The Ritz Paris describes them as devoted patrons who relished staying at the Ritz. The hotel established the Windsor suite in their honor. The Duchess's wardrobe was legendary. Montboucher designed her wedding dress. She patronized Givenchy, Dior, Balenciaga, the leading couturiers of the era. Her jewelry collection would eventually sell at auction for tens of millions of dollars. The Cartier Panther pieces alone represented more wealth than most families would see in generations. They employed large domestic staffs, servants, secretaries, chauffeurs. They entertained prominent guests, including Winston Churchill. They traveled constantly, always in comfort. This was barely surviving. This was the hardship that justified complaining to a grieving 84-year-old woman whose son had just died, paying the bills. The contrast between the brothers could not be more complete. George took a crown he never wanted. He carried it through a war. He stayed in London while bombs fell. He ate hot dogs with Roosevelt to secure American goodwill. He lunched with Churchill every Tuesday to discuss strategy. He visited troops in forward positions. He lost a lung to surgery. He died at 56, worn out by duty. Edward threw the crown away. He visited Nazi Germany. He sat out the war in the Bahamas. He complained about money constantly. He lived in Paris mansions. He died in 1972 at 77, having never worked a real day since 1936. One brother gave everything. The other complained it wasn't enough. Here's something that makes the money complaints even worse. Edward spoke German fluently. His family background made it practically a heritage language. Queen Victoria spoke German with Prince Albert. Queen Mary was born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, Teck being a German duchy. Kaiser Wilhelm II was Edward's first cousin once removed. Edward demonstrated his German fluency publicly during his 1937 Nazi visit, conducting conversations with officials in their own language. He could understand German perfectly. So when you see scenes where Edward seems impatient during German conversation, as if he can't follow what's being said, remember, he could. He simply chose to be dismissive. Another performance, another grievance manufactured. The pattern is always the same. Edward believed the world owed him comfort, status, deference. When it wasn't provided, when he had to share attention or show patience, or acknowledge anyone else's suffering, he performed inconvenience. He made everything about himself, including his mother's grief. You've noticed the parallels to more recent royal drama. I know you have. A golden child, once the family's most popular member, who walked away from duty and now complains publicly from a comfortable exile. The comment sections have drawn the connection. I'll leave it there. But here's what I find remarkable. Edward was once genuinely beloved. As Prince of Wales in the 1920s and early 1930s, his popularity rivaled that of any royal in British history. Britannica notes his popularity rivaled, if it did not exceed, that of his grandfather, King Edward.VII, when the latter was Prince of Wales. During his 1919 Canadian tour, Edward shook so many hands his right hand became injured and swollen. He had to switch to his left. Newsreels captured his every appearance. His clothing influenced fashion. He seemed to represent a modern monarchy for a democratic age. And then he threw it away. Not for love. Plenty of people have loved unsuitable partners without betraying their country. He threw it away because he couldn't accept that being royal came with constraints. The same entitlement that made him complain about money in 1952 was the entitlement that made him choose Wallace over duty in 1936. Same flaw, different decade. Queen Mary died on March 24, 1953, 10 weeks before her granddaughter Elizabeth's coronation. She was 85. She'd spent her final months watching one son die of exhaustion and listening to another complain about money. George VI earned every pound he paid to Edward. He earned it with his presence in London during the Blitz. He earned it with his lumbar sympathectomy in 1949. He earned it with his lung resection in 1951. He earned it with Tuesday lunches and troop visits and Christmas broadcasts and cold tarmacs watching his daughter fly away. Edward earned nothing. He complained anyway. That's the prosecution. That's the case. One scene, a man complaining about money to his grieving mother. tells you everything about who Edward VIII was. But it only makes sense when you understand who his brother was, what George sacrificed, what the crown cost him. The mathematics of entitlement: £10,000, 249,750 in today's money. Paid by a man who died at 56, received by a man who thought it wasn't enough. George VI gave Britain everything he had. Edward VIII gave Britain nothing and wanted more. Subscribe for more stories like this.